It seems appropriate for this meeting.
Well, in that case, let me just get it back.
Because, you are at your house. You're not going to church. No, that looks great.
There we go.
There you go. Let's just talk about shelter.
Sure.
Um,
You want me to go
I
over
think
these
I think
quick?
what we'd like to do. I mean, it's such a fantastic piece, and it seems so apropos to the times, and it's so poetic and beautiful, and I can't wait to see it. And how big is it? I couldn't quite figure that out.
It's 24 by 30 something inches is the platform.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it's about 20 inches high.
Oh, so it's a fairly substantial piece.
And it's about 26 inches long. And
Hmm.
wide, it's well, 20 inches wide.
Wow.
Those are all
Wow.
approximate, give or take an inch.
Yeah. And there's how many beds? 84, 94?
96.
96 beds. You know, when we had our last conversation, which I forgot to record, we spoke about this piece, which is like a warehouse. It's like a reproduction of a warehouse in a sense.
Yeah,
That doubles also as a kind of hospital, but it seemed to have some strong connections to the piece titled Warehouse that you did many years ago. That is in a collection here in Calgary. And when we were speaking about that lineage, you spoke about the actual warehouse that is in London, Ontario, that in a sense inspired this idea as a warehouse as a container for memory and so on.
yeah,
Could you talk a little bit about that?
yeah,
And
gladly.
that particular warehouse and the sort of first experiences you had in that spot?
Absolutely. It was a warehouse. Well, it was actually a manufactory for General Steelwares, which is on the river about 4 or 5 blocks south of where my studio is. They used to manufacture refrigerators, stoves, and they've been there since the 19th century. And they were a major manufacturer in London. In fact, they even had their own powerhouse with the steam engine and everything else that sat beside the river at one point. And I remember all this as a child, but they finally sold off the factory after they closed because things were being manufactured cheaper and elsewhere.
When was that? Do you remember?
I don't. I would have to say, gosh, probably in the 80s.
Yeah.
No, in the early 70s. Sorry, in the early 70s.
Hmm.
Because I sort of rediscovered it for myself in the 80s.
In the 80s, okay.
Yeah, so they literally destroyed everything except this one building, which I guess they were hoping to rent as a storage facility or something.
Mm-hmm.
And a number of other outbuildings that were sort of like for loading up trucks, like for transitionary material. And they're still there, and they're full of small businesses, little startups and stuff like that.
Oh, interesting.
So this building, even though it was abandoned, it was 3 floors. I was able to break into it many times, and I photographed it.
Mm.
And the one thing that whenever I was in there, it always, when you get a big space, that your imagination tends to grow with the size of the architecture.
Yeah.
And I started imagining that, these empty buildings, a good use for them would be if you could house memories or dreams. There was a bit of nostalgia about the building itself because it dated back to the 19th century, but also I sort of projected in the Jungian sense, of having these things float. When you walked in, it would, something would float here, would float there, almost like these ghostly sort of memories would come back to you. And they were warehoused like a library. So it'd be a library of memories or dreams or something like that. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of what gave me the idea of
a sort of archive.
Yeah. So what I did, I photographed it. I took really beautiful photographs of it in perfect 1-point perspective, so I could sort of use it, collage-wise, in making some of this stuff come true, because this was pre-digital, so everything done with analog color photographs, and I would just glue things in there. And it's a strategy I'd used years before in some really early photographic works when I didn't have a studio. So I did have a history and a pattern of appropriating spaces I wanted to work in through photography.
So you're, excuse me, but you're going in there in the 80s sometime,
Yeah,
early 80s.
that's correct. Yeah. So I would just wander around, imagining what would happen. And then, like I said, I would photograph it. I get the color photographs printed and take it to my studio or workspace. And I just play around and see what could be done with them. And through that came my first big public projection, outside of the one I did in my house. But the first one I ever did that was public in an old warehouse was on Granville Island in,
Right.
in Vancouver. And it was a
And
shipwreck.
it was also a sort of warehouse of some kind.
Yeah, these were kit houses. They were, or kit warehouses. Sorry, you could buy them by the foot, and they were usually like a central structure held up by the pillars with just a triangular roof and maybe skylights along
Yeah.
the side, and then side things like this. So the shape was
Right.
like this, and then up, and then like that. And they would
They're
run
quite
like,
common
yes, yeah.
they're quite common in Vancouver along the shipyards and stuff.
Well, in fact, there's some behind my studio building. There's a couple of short
Is
ones.
there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they would run like a gantry crane down the middle so they could move things throughout the warehouse, and the offices would be in the side wings and the storage. So any
Yeah.
manufacturing would go on in the center.
Yeah.
So I just fell in love with that. So anyways, I did this piece in Vancouver. I can't remember the exact date now. I've got it written down, but I left my notes in the other room. You want me to grab them for the dates?
Sure.
Yeah.
We were talking about the Granville
Yeah.
Island piece.
And that was done in 1990.
And what was the title of that piece?
There was no title,
Oh,
not that I can recall.
can you
It was
describe
oh
it a
yeah, no,
little?
just projection. It was just a projection in the ship, something in the shipwrights building, Granville Island, and it just stated the dates.
And can you describe the piece a little bit?
Absolutely. Well, I think I described the actual building. And
Yeah,
then
you
in
did.
the big front loading doors, I placed a 4 foot high by 8 foot wide screen, and I rear projected a hand caressing a photograph. So let's say this is a photograph. What you had was a hand just sort of tracing the outside
Mm-hmm.
as if wanting to possess it. And
Mm-hmm.
what it was a photograph of my daughter when she was about 3 years old in a fairground ride, little merry-go-round car,
Mm-hmm.
for tots. And it's an image, a photograph I always liked, even though it was blurry. And so I was thinking at that time about how you can possess things through photography, and I guess I wanted to act that out, like that physical touching of the photograph.
Mm.
Meaning that you touch that icon of something that you want to possess, or something you want to absorb or assimilate.
Or something you want to remember.
No, I think it goes deeper than that. I think the thing about photography I always found was, it's a moment, a very specific moment in time. And I think that people respond to it much deeper than simply as a remembrance. I think there's a very emotional attachment to that particular moment. I mean, not all photographs, but certainly some photographs. So I think it's a deeper relationship than simply nostalgia or something like that. It depends on the circumstance. Like any photograph is informed by its moment in time, and any text that goes with it, or any narrative that's spoken about it, and that can change with time as well and experience.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it does house some sort of iconic something or other. I'm sorry, I'm not an academic, so it's hard for me to find the right words for it, but I think it goes much deeper than simply a remembrance or a souvenir or anything like that.
But I was trying to use the word memory in terms of its larger, with larger implications that take in all of what you've said. You look at a picture of your mother on Mother's Day, and it may be more than just remembering her or being sentimental about her and experience you had with her. It goes, it can possibly move you in a way that is more profound than just simply remembering the person.
Well, that's exactly what I was trying to say. You said it more eloquently than I did. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And like I said, and it really is a product of time and context and a lot of other things. But somehow photographs seem to house that. Unlike moving images, take you from somewhere to somewhere else. in real time. But a photograph somehow freezes something that, or maybe frees you to uh, uh, work or live within another moment, another time.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and it
Yeah.
doesn't tell you what that should be or how you should respond to it. Whereas
Hmm.
I think with moving images, there tends to be a directive as to what
Hmm.
you should be thinking about something.
So the Granville piece was an attempt to try to express that concept, that idea.
But in the concept of me thinking that these abandoned buildings could be these sort of repository of these things.
Right.
So, there was no announcement. So when people walked by, it was just like the surprise thing that happened.
Right.
And again, this was pre-digital, so this sort of spectacle was something that was unique at the time.
And did you then? So that's 1990.
Yeah,
Is this so? Is Warehouse comes a little bit after that piece? Is that correct?
the structure itself.
No, the piece titled
Yes,
Warehouse.
yes, yeah,
Yeah,
yes, it did. Yeah, I can't remember. I don't have it in front of me.
I
So
think it must have come around 1991, 92.
around that time, yeah, because I wanted to
Yeah,
build one, so
yeah,
I did.
yeah. And let's talk about the first iteration of that piece, which I believe was first shown at the Illingsworth Kerr Gallery at the Alberta College of Art and Design, if I'm not mistaken.
That's exactly where it was shown. Yeah, first
Yeah,
time.
and then it was shown again at our place at
Yes.
Trépanier Bear
Yep.
a year or two later.
Yeah, and then it went
And
to
then,
storage, I believe. Oh no, that's not true.
well,
It was
then
shown in Windsor.
it was shown in Windsor,
That's right.
right?
Yeah,
Well, I think it was acquired when we showed it prior it going to Windsor.
that's correct. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Vince Varga, I think, curated into a show.
Who's that? Sorry?
Vince Varga?
Oh, Vince. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's right. He was the
he was
curator or
the
director
curator at
there
the
at
time.
the
Yeah,
time.
it was a nice
Yeah,
show, I recall.
yeah.
Piece looked really good.
Let's for the sake of the listener talk a little about Warehouse and the first iteration of that piece. So it's connected to the warehouse you were describing, the General what was it called? General
General
Steel Warehouse.
Steelwares.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I have this funny habit. I collect things. I accumulate things, and
Hmm.
oftentimes I'll accumulate uh, collections, not just a thing, but lay a whole collection, right?
Right.
Anything from buttons to flags to you name it. And I always have boxes full of this stuff in my studio. And when I built Warehouse, realizing I couldn't do a number of projections in there because at the time the technology was just starting with uh, uh, small Sony projectors, but they were so expensive I couldn't afford them. But I had all these 60 millimeter projectors, but I couldn't project 7 or 8 films in there, which is what I wanted to do. So I just started using objects in place of these sort of visual icons. So I started using it literally as a warehouse to warehouse all these objects, and I just buried the whole first floor. It was just full of stuff, right
Right.
up to the second floor. And then in the middle, towards the back, there was a huge hole, a pit where these things were climbing up.
Right.
And right on the edge of this pit was a guy in a red T-shirt. That's all he had on, covering his genitalia, teetering on the edge as if he was going to just completely be subsumed and fell into
Yeah.
this hole. And some
Did
of
he
the,
have a hat? Did he have a hat on? Does he
I
have a
don't,
dunce's hat
I don't
on?
think he did. I don't think he did. Not
No.
in that piece, no.
Okay.
Um, but what was interesting, I used some old contemporary art tropes from wasn't it the German artist that worked with felt and with that? What was his name?
Joseph Beuys.
Both the boys, pieces that were crawling up to greet the little guy in the thing. So there's a roll of
Hmm.
felt and some other things that were
Hmm.
sort of tropes of our contemporary art at that time.
Hmm.
I was a big fan of some of Joseph Beuys's work, so I
Yeah.
thought it was a nice thing to do.
Yeah.
So, and that was it. So you would, and there was no window, so you could peer in and see all this stuff, this accumulation, because it was kind of falling out all over the place. And so that was my first attempt at it, but it was based on what I had at hand at the time.
Yeah. But that then morphed into the piece, right?
That's right. Once the flood had wiped out all that material, with the exception of,
But I don't think we talked about the fact that you actually reproduced that warehouse that was in
yeah,
London.
that's right. I was just about to mention that. Once the flood happened and that piece, all that material stuff was a victim of the flood and it was full of mud.
No, but you reproduced the actual warehouse the first time. I don't think we talked
Oh,
about
I'm
that.
sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Forgive me. Yeah, we're talking about the one I used to break into.
Yeah,
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 I rebuilt that. Yeah, 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 complete. I went and measured it and everything,
yeah,
and I
yeah.
made it out of concrete.
Yeah,
I made
yeah.
it
That was
exactly the way they had built it. I made the forms, poured the concrete, but instead of water, I used what's called Roadplex, which is the foundation for acrylic paints. It's like a liquid
yeah,
toxic,
yeah,
so it'll last forever.
yeah.
It's like, the concrete is now entombed in plastic. It's been plasticized, so to speak. So that's how I built it. But I had a lot of fun building it. I learned an awful lot about structure, and I used Doric columns.
Mm-hmm.
I have a great story about the Doric column. Can I tell a dirty story? Okay, so I went to this bridal supply place where you could buy these plastic columns, the cake separators.
Yeah,
I didn't know what size I needed, so I bought like small ones and I bought large ones like that. So
yeah.
I put some of this basket, I put the big one under my arm, right? And I go up to the woman behind the counter and I'm standing there like this. And the woman's looking at me. I understand why she's staring at me. I'm unconsciously stroking this big column under my arm. I'll never forget that moment. The minute I realized what I was doing, my face turned absolutely beet red.
And did she say anything to you?
She didn't say anything. She realized how embarrassed I was, and I just paid red. I
Right.
walked out of there. I'll tell you, well, you saw a guy walking out kind of like this, trying to disappear out the door as fast as he could.
Yeah,
So,
and then a few minutes later, the cops are right behind you.
uh, they didn't catch me because I got on my bike and I was out of there pretty damn fast.
Well, I remember the piece fondly, and it was a piece that it is a piece that that moved so many people, including the person who acquired it eventually.
So I understood, yeah.
And back to this notion of memory, um, and this idea of perhaps even selective memory. As we age, we end up being alone, perhaps, as we approach death, and our our memory is bare, stripped, in some ways, and it makes us perhaps quite
It
anxious.
makes room for more memories, Eve.
Yeah, it does. It
Great
does.
humor,
But
right? You keep living and you make other
yeah,
ones.
yeah,
That's the way it works, I think.
yeah,
I mean, my memory was bad from the get-go. When I was younger, it didn't matter. I remember when I was teaching, my students would get upset because I couldn't. It took me months to remember their names.
yeah.
Finally, after all their complaining, which was justified, I said to them, "Look, I have the lyrics of every pop song ever written since 1953 in my head. There's not much more room for your names." And the worst part was, and I'm leading up to something, so bear with me. I have a knack now. If I'm in a situation, for some reason, an appropriate pop song to that situation comes up in my head, and I'll start singing it like the earworm, in my mind, while whatever is going on is going on.
Hmm.
Now, the reason I bring that up, and it's a good segue to where I'm going, is that the second iteration of the warehouse,
Mm-hmm.
even though I could have used an accumulation of all the other stuff that I had, I decided not to. I wanted to get a little bit closer to that idea of, 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 of say, memory, or uh, uh, memories or dreams or anything else. So I decided to use audio to fill it with audio. And I
Mm-hmm.
specifically wanted to fill it with audios of people that remember what happened to them during the flood, and other audio that I've always liked, wanted to use, other quotations from other and different type of experiences. These were people recollecting experiences through audio.
Right.
So what I did, I put together this long soundtrack that now it's literally plays in the space, and with the leftover character hovering above, but instead of having Joseph Boy's memorabilia climbing up, he now has ladders, so you can now enter the
Mm-hmm.
space if you so chose to. It's no
Mm-hmm.
longer threatening, but it's still about anxiety. There's still this anxiety. It's about all these things these memories cause.
And it's also about remembering that particular event that happened in Calgary in 2013.
Did you say it wasn't?
It was.
Yeah, it was. Mostly it was, along with other type of
Yeah,
them.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, we haven't seen the new iteration yet, and we hope that we'll be able to do that when the piece is shown at Contemporary Calgary in the fall. But for those people who are listening to this, the piece, the original piece titled Warehouse, was acquired by a collector here in Calgary, who in 2013 was renovating his home, and a good portion of his collection was being stored in a storage facility in downtown Calgary. And during the flood, that facility was, the bottom floor of that facility was flooded out, where this person had some of the work stored. And Warehouse was one of the pieces affected. It was thought at the time that the actual structure of the warehouse that Wynne was just speaking about might be able to be restored. And so we sent whatever bits and pieces remained of the piece that were in relatively decent condition back to London to Wynne. And we found out that the piece was not really salvageable, but there was an agreement that the piece could be rebuilt. Wynne agreed to that with the collector who bought it. And in fact, that's what we're talking about, is this new iteration of this piece, yeah. Which is I'm looking, we're all looking forward to seeing it, because it has such a powerful connection to that event, but also it's a piece that was shown here on several occasions in Calgary and other places in the country. So there'll be a lot of memory about that event and that piece, and people's interaction with that piece and their relationship to it.
Now I'm quaking in my shoes because no one's seen it. I'm the only one that's seen it.
Yeah, exactly. No one, we haven't had a chance
Oh,
to show it
boy.
since. So it will be interesting. I think when it is finally shown, it would be interesting to have some documentation of the original piece alongside, in a didactic panel, and an explanation of what happened and so on. I think that would
Nice
that would be
idea.
great
Well, I
interest.
do have slides of it.
Yeah, and
I'm
we
sure
have lots of, I think, good pictures of the
that,
original piece
and I
in situ at
documented
the
the
gallery.
rebuilding of the new one as well. So I have
Pardon
lots
me?
of, I documented the rebuilding of the new one as well. So I have
Yeah,
lots of images of that as well. So yeah, it'd be
yeah,
kind of nice to do. It's a nice gesture. Yeah, I like that.
yeah, yeah. So now here we are in 2020, and we're living with COVID, and you've just finished a piece titled Shelter,
Mhm.
which is not about memory. It's a piece that whose the main structure of the piece is a warehouse, this warehouse, but the I think perhaps the motivation for making the piece is quite different from the other warehouse pieces that you've made. Um, could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the
Um,
actual structure was meant, again, for me, thinking I could build a structure that I could project something into. And
right.
frankly, the structure itself was kind of thrown together rather shoddily, because I think I was doing it more to take a photograph, so I could actually do a digital version of all these things floating around in the space. In other
Hmm.
words, video as opposed to a sculpture. Uh, well, the video didn't work very well. The structure didn't lend itself to what I wanted to. So I stuck it under my work table for a while. And then one morning around 4 o'clock in the morning, I was listening to CBC's radio program
Ideas.
called Ideas. And they were interviewing the finalists for the Sobey Awards from 2019. And one of them was a young Montreal artist whose name just skips my mind. This is where memory
Yeah,
fails.
I think
Names.
his first name is Pierre.
I think
We're
so,
talking
yeah.
about the painter, right?
No, I'm talking about this. He's more of a social activist artist.
Yeah,
And
but he's also a painter.
oh, I didn't know that. Anyways,
Yeah.
I was listening to his ideas, and he was describing his work and ideas, and that really fascinated me. I was really impressed with this stuff. So when
Hmm.
I woke up that morning, I went online, I looked him up, and I looked at some of the work, and I was specific to the ideas that he was talking about. And
Uh-huh.
I was kind of disappointed in it, but it did twig an idea for me that I should take my existing building and turn it into just a shelter, and the reason why I did that is because my wife and I Uh, and well, she more now than I was, but I was deeply involved with the homeless shelter here in town called the Unity Project.
Right.
And I was chair of one of their big fundraising project called Up with Art, which is just coming up in a few weeks, by the way.
Yeah.
And I just thought this is, this would just make a really nice piece about this concept of shelter. And so
Mm-hmm.
I went about building all these beds out of brass and foam core. And in fact, I can show you. I actually thought of bringing one out today. So this is
Mm-hmm.
one here. I think you can see it. I made
Mm-hmm.
96 of these. They're actually to scale, so they would be
Mm-hmm.
like for a 6.5 foot man or woman.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I made 96 of those, and we just lined them all up on the floor. And I made a second floor out of plexiglass, so it's
Mm-hmm.
transparent. So these beds would float above the beds are in the middle and the side wings
Mm-hmm.
above that. And then I also put an audio system in, and I made a soundtrack of "When You Wish Upon a Star" being sung by Jiminy Cricket in the original Pinocchio film by Walt Disney. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that was a song that really influenced me in my life because it's all about hope and all about wishing and all about dreaming. All these things, that I was trying to sort of project into all these empty, abandoned ideas and spaces. So I thought this was appropriate. But, when you see the piece and you hear the music, it's really intriguing after a while, but then it turns, it turns.
Yeah, it does.
I don't know how else to say it. It just turns. And all of a sudden you realize this is not a good thing, that this is not something that should be existing. This
Yeah.
need should not be there.
Yeah.
It simply shouldn't be there. And why can't we solve this?
Yeah.
Why are we holding out hope in a culture that never really fulfills it?
Yeah. Well, in the context of the pandemic, the piece resonates from the point of view of the possibility of those beds having to be used by people who are sick,
Or anyone else in
you know,
disaster. It's hurricane season.
disaster or whatever. So it speaks very, I think, hauntingly about the possibility of like a horrible thing happening down the road. And here is this
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
preparatory kind of stance or position or shelter that we've built and are taking to, in the hopes that it won't happen.
No, but it's like the photograph. Different context, different meaning, different relationships to it.
Yeah.
The viewer will bring a very different relationship to that. They will, of course, do with
Yeah.
COVID-19
Yeah.
or any
Yeah.
disaster, even perhaps the flood. All the
Yeah.
people displaced by the flood had to stay somewhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
Well, the people in Fort McMurray have yet again been displaced. There was a huge fire there several years ago, and many people lost
now
their
the
homes.
flood, yeah. The
And
whole
now
core
they're being
downtown that
flooded
was
out.
destroyed.
Pardon me?
Well, the whole core downtown was flooded in Fort McMurray, and a lot
Yeah.
of the houses that had just been rebuilt were caught in the flood.
Yeah.
I can't imagine going through that. I mean, I think I would be completely emotionally distraught. And
Yeah. Yeah.
how do you climb out of that?
Yeah, it's very difficult, I would imagine. And in the context of what we're going through today, shelter, for example, it takes on a different meaning because we couldn't build a shelter like that or house people in a community center or a school gym or whatever under the conditions that
Not anymore.
that we find ourselves in
You,
COVID.
you can only warehouse the ill.
Pardon me?
You can only warehouse the ill.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
the
Exactly.
exact opposite of
Yeah.
no longer offers shelter. It offers perhaps the end of the road. It's a
Yeah.
different type of warehouse.
It's a beautiful, poetic, resonant piece that I'm really looking forward to showing at some point soon, physically showing. But in the interim, what we're going to do is post that wonderful video that you produced, that short video.
That's great.
So
Thank you for that.
we'll do that in the next couple of days.
Okay.
And I hope that we'll be able to then also post a few images of Warehouse and the Vancouver projection. It would be great if you had a photo of the original Warehouse available.
Unfortunately, I don't. But I built a maquette, a model of it.
Oh, you did? Okay, that'd be cool
But,
too.
yeah, I wasn't happy. I mean, Robert Kazier did photographs for me. He
Yeah,
did a
yeah,
beautiful job, but I was never happy with the photos. I really wanted to do it again. So I built a model. I got the blueprints because
hmm
after I had done the projection, they were going to remodel that to be a rehearsal space for the theater on Granville Island.
Yeah.
So they
Yeah.
generously sent me the blueprints.
No, very good.
So I built a wooden model of it, which is about 4 feet
Mhm.
long, and I
Mhm.
projected the original film, the 16 millimeter film inside, which has now
Mhm.
been digitized. So it's a very small, tiny little video
Right.
projector.
Yeah.
But the quality is better, it's improved, and it's self-contained. It's a beautiful structure. In fact, I
Mhm.
did a lecture in San Francisco at this famous photo gallery, which name escapes me as well. And I
Mhm.
showed uh, the warehouse, and they thought it was the real warehouse. But I was
Mhm.
showing them the maquette, and I was
Mhm.
really, really happy because I didn't know I had the talent to be able to build something that well. And here I feel all these like artists and architects and stuff like that, and I'm thinking that that's a real building. You
Yeah.
know, so
Yeah.
I felt pretty good about that.
You should. You should. You
It was
you
really,
you always you always downplay your abilities, which is
oh
always
no, I really
surprises me.
didn't know I could do this even until I decided to do that.
Well, isn't
Really?
that the way though? I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
you have to figure it out as you go along, and sometimes you realize something pretty good.
Well, that's been
Um,
the story of my life. I wish I could take credit and say, yeah, I planned it. I planned everything. I do that way. No, I think the only thing I have is an instinct to know, oh, that's not bad. Maybe I should stop.
that's a very good instinct. I
Yeah, I
know
think,
others who don't stop and who overwork the thing to the point of destroying it, pretty
yeah,
much.
well, it's worked for me all these years now. So
Yeah.
yeah. And you can
Yeah.
tell I have a lot of fun doing these things.
Yeah.
It's,
Well, I want to thank you for this.
you're very welcome.
And I'm
My
sorry
pleasure.
that I didn't hit or press record in our last little interview, but this has been fun, and I think I'm pleased that we're able to speak about the new piece, and I'm looking forward to showing it pretty soon.
Uh, I'm happy to have done it. Thanks a lot for doing it. And
Okay.